London. And in fact, in a later session this afternoon, he's going to be talking about his brand new book, which is a new history of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919. This session takes us back to his first book on Thuggee. And in fact, across Kim's 4 books, I think we see a sustained engagement with the question of violence in British colonial India. This was the beginning of the exploration. Kim then wrote a book on the Great Fear of 1857, and he wrote a more recent book just a couple of years ago called The Skull of Alum Bheg. And I think through all of those works, as we're going to hear today, there's been a sustained engagement with the centrality of violence to British rule, but also with the nature of the colonial archive. One of the things I think Kim has been interested in doing in all of his work, going back to the Thuggee book, is to pry apart the levels and layers of self-justification and imperial rhetoric, to think about both the violence itself and also how the British justified it to themselves and perhaps tried to justify it to a wider public. So without any further ado, Kim, please talk to us about Thuggee.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sunil. It's a pleasure being here. And Sunil pretty much just gave my talk and summarized it nicely, but I'll try and keep you entertained. So I actually started working on the subject of Thuggee 18 years ago, and I've then done a lot of other things in the meantime, but I've just been commissioned to write the introduction for the Oxford University World Classics edition of Philip Meadows Taylor's famous novel, Confessions of a Thug, which I'll talk a bit about because it's really a crucial text and has been described as the first Anglo-Indian novel. And you may or may not have heard about it. It was published in 1839 and has not been out of print since then. Philip Meadows Taylor was one of those young Englishmen who went to India at the beginning of the 19th century to seek his fortune, but ended up working actually for an Indian ruler. And it was only later in life that he used his literary talent to essentially become one of the key voices. Before Kipling, there's a genre of literature where Meadows Taylor looms very large. And the novel was an immense success when it came out in 1839. Queen Victoria, she was reading proofs even before they were printed, and it has since been reproduced in a number of ways. Now, the novel itself, as the title implies, Confessions of a Thug, is premised on a conversation between a Sahib, who's Meadows Taylor himself, and the thug prisoner, who is the informant and who confesses to the Sahib. So the entire book is the voice, it could almost be an interview with a thug. It's called Confessions of a Thug. The way that Taylor, he prefaced it, was that he say, this is real. I've met this man, and everything you will read in this book is authentic. I've changed a few things for dramatic effect, but really everything that you read is a true revelation of this mysterious thing, which at the time was quite a novelty, the subject of Thuggee. Throughout the novel, which is basically Amir Ali recounting his life and his adventures, there are little interspersed sections where Amir Ali, he addresses Meadows Taylor and constantly confirms the authenticity of what's being said, but also confirms Meadows Taylor's knowledge of India. And in many ways, the novel embodies what is really a key theme within the establishment of the British colonial state, namely the notion of colonial knowledge as the power that enabled the British to rule India, not through violence, not through coercion, but through a deep cultural knowledge. And so Amir Ali, he talks about how his parents were killed when he was a child, and he was adopted by these bandits who had killed his parents, and gradually he came to realize that they were not just bandits, but they were thugs who strangled travelers. And Amir Ali, throughout his life, becomes a famous thug himself. at some points he fights for the Pindaris. This is of course during a period when British rule in India is only gradually being expanded. It's not till 1818 that the British are really the sovereign power on this South Asian subcontinent. So it's very much also a story of the expansion of British rule because we know what the conclusion to Amir Ali's life is, namely that he's captured and he comes to work for the British. And the book, The Confession, is at the heart of that work, namely to provide the British with information about Thuggee, banditry, but also by extension Indian life, Indian customs, all the things that would have seemed strange and exotic from a British perspective in the early 19th century. There's one problem. Amir Ali never existed, and it is actually fiction. It's presented as fact, but it's actually fiction. And even today you'll find scholars who are sort of confused about the contents and the veracity of the contents of the novel. But Amir Ali is a constructed character. So you have an Englishman writing in the voice of an Indian in what I would describe as a distinct genre in its own right, namely colonial ventriloquism. Kipling does it later. Kim, kind of, the novel Kim, the narrative voice very, very clearly moves between an English gaze and then an authentic Indian voice at the same time. But Meadows Taylor is basically inventing an Indian character and writing through him. So instead of this being the truth about the Thugs or of India, it is a British writer creating an Indian character to prove to the British that they know everything and that they have unmediated access to Indian society. And that's, in a sense, the British attempt at convincing themselves that they do possess this cultural knowledge. Because the biggest concern is, as foreign rulers in India, is the inability to gauge what's going on under the surface. The fear of the jungle drums purveying hidden messages, of conspiracies, of which the Thugs, of course, a key example, but it comes up in 1857 again. This notion that there are chapatis being circulated, strange rumors, people somewhere you can't see behind the scene, pulling strings and making things happen. So a lot of the British endeavor to expand their control and their reign over India is about fighting what Sunil and my former supervisor, C.A. Bailey, described as information panic. The fear that the British state simply did not know what was going on, and which is of course absolutely crippling for a colonial state which ultimately rules through coercion rather than consent. You have to be able to know what's going on. So the novel, which is what it is, it's fiction, provides the solution to that. It's the British telling themselves a story that they have complete access to Indian society. So it's a fantasy of surveillance, of colonial surveillance, that is presented in this story about the Thugs. Which, again, as I mentioned, ties into this notion that the British colonial state was what has been described as an ethnographic state, ruled through this deep cultural knowledge of indigenous society. As part of the novel, you hear a lot about the despotic nature of Indian rule, the kind of arbitrary, brutal punishment that Maharajas, they mete out to bandits, but of course also about this phenomenon known as Thuggee. So there's a lot of lack of clarity in terms of the terms themselves. So the word Thug is what the person, and Thuggee is the practice or the phenomenon, like bandit and banditry. So Thuggee is the phenomenon of the Thugs, who supposedly worship the goddess Kali and strangle travelers on the roads, and who murdered in a strictly ritualistic manner, observed all these different religious omens and rules. And the suppression of Thuggee, which takes place essentially during the 1830s, really becomes one of the cornerstones for the case for British rule in India. This is what legitimizes the expansion of European control. The abolition of sati, of widow burning as well, takes the stage as part of these sort of core examples of the blessings of Western civilization. And indeed, that is why Thuggee becomes so famous, or rather infamous, is that it provides a very clear example of the absolute moral justification for colonial rule in India. What could be more just and righteous than stopping superstitious, backwards practices such as widow burning or the ritual strangling of people? So what do we do with that, since the novel itself is a piece of fiction? And here's a key thing: the only evidence we have about the Thugs comes from the British colonial archives that Sunil referred to. It's thanks to this sort of bureaucratic obsession of the colonial state that we have reams and reams of material, police reports, trial, interviews, these kind of material, that we can say anything about the phenomenon at all. But there are no independent sources, which of course provides a really difficult problem for the historian. How can you describe a phenomenon when it's only recorded by a foreign power, the colonial state, through the process of persecuting and suppressing them? You have the same situation if you're looking at early modern European or medieval history. What do we know about witchcraft? Essentially only when women were accused of witchcraft and tortured, made to confess. How can you construct a historical narrative with this kind of material? We all know any kind of confessions, even today, that could have been made under coercion. That's certainly also the case historically. So what do we do as historians to move beyond this impasse? Since the layers of cultural stereotypes, the Christian notion that whatever the Indians they do, Indians are superstitious, they're bound by caste to observe all these weird things. What do we do with that material? If we can of course say, as some post-colonial historians and scholars have actually said, that, well, it didn't exist, the British made it up. And we could in a sense say, well, yeah, but that actually stops us. If we simply acknowledge that the power dynamics that are embedded in this problematic material, if we simply accept that problem and leave it at like that, well, we can't say very much about very many things. So what I've tried to do is to take this really difficult historical evidence, what Sunil referred to as a colonial archive, and read it against the grain. How can we take forced confessions? How can we take European accounts of Indian customs and say something that is not simply a replication, which is not simply a perpetuation of Orientalist stereotypes? And so that's what I did for my PhD many, many years ago, and have since worked on. I was sitting in the National Archives in Delhi and going through all these old reports from the early 19th century. And there was a particular region that kept popping up, being mentioned in these records. It was called Sindhus, a village area, which was around 1812. This became the center of focus for the British efforts. As the British were expanding their rule in India, it became the focus of British attentions, and really the first time the British, they had a sustained interaction and encounter with this phenomenon of Thuggee. And so, being a historian, I thought, I look at the map, where is this? And I could actually find it on a map, and it's located between Gwalior and Etawah, but it's a tiny, tiny village. Today as well. But I convinced a friend to rent a jeep and go there together. And as we went in, the landscape changed. When you cross Chambal River and you enter into what we all know today as the dacoity, bandit badlands of Chambal Valley, you have these ravines that creates sort of a labyrinth landscape, which is, of course, where bandits, they can hide very easily and still do to this day. And when I arrived at the village, I was a bit worried what I would say when I told the locals, well, I hear 200 years ago your forefathers were stranglers, what the response would be. But so when I sort of cautiously slipped it in that, I'm looking at this phenomenon known as Thuggee, they said, oh yeah, there used to be thugs around here all over the place. So there was actually an oral tradition about what this phenomenon was, but it was very, very different from what the British accounts would lead us to believe. And the key was in the landscape itself. Of course, it's in a political borderlands. It's between Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, which historically has also been a political border area. It's geographically inaccessible, and so it is perfect bandit territory. There's no arable land, really, because of the ravines. You can't grow anything. You can't really produce anything. So how can you sustain a community? You need an outside source of income. And what do you do in an area that's populated by Rajputs? You become soldiers. You become mercenaries. So, and so for me to just see the landscape, I came to realize that actually there are very, very pragmatic reasons why particular forms of violent crime might evolve or emerge in this particular area. And as I talked to the villagers, somebody mentioned Fulan Devi, the bandit queen whom you may know about, who was active in the 1980s. And they say, yeah, she lived in the next village over. So this is actually an area where there has been bandits since the early 19th century and active even today. And now what are dacoits about? Again, of course, today there's a social aspect to it. There's sort of caste tensions. But again, it is about territories where you have no other viable source of income. And in the early 19th century, what you would do is you would become a mercenary. You could fight for the Pindaris. You would become a strongman or guard for a local landlord. But as the British, they are expanding their rule, East India Company, defeating the Pindaris, settling the different states. The British, they're disarming all the local armies, right? One of the hallmarks of the colonial state is an absolute monopoly on violence. So Indian armies are disbanded, which means northern India is literally flooded with armed men who no longer have anywhere to, they're no longer getting a paycheck. So what do? You become a bandit. So we can actually see, just by reconstructing the landscape where these thugs, they emerge, we can actually explain the phenomenon in a very, very different way than the British were ever able to. To the British, there was no rationale behind Thuggee. To the British, it was a product of religious superstition, of an evidence of Indian backwardness. If you think about sort of the depiction of India and of Kali in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which is of course a horrific Hollywoodized stereotype, it doesn't need any explanation. It simply is, because that is what India is. In that sense, Thuggee also becomes symptomatic of everything that's wrong with India as a place of superstition and backwardness, and therefore legitimizes the expansion of British rule. So we have this sort of baseline where we can begin to look at Thuggee not just as a colonial construction, not just as a superstitious practice, but as a social practice, a result of socioeconomic disruption and dislocation as a result of the broader political chaos that northern India was thrown into as the Mughal control gradually declined. Which is why it's not just fascinating to look at stranglers. It's when we're tracing the story of the thugs, you're also, in a sense, tracing the story of British rule in India, how it came about, and the gradual expansion. Now, were they simply bandits? This is where it becomes really interesting, and where the work that has been carried out in a European historical context on witches, on heretics, are extremely useful. Because we still had this problem. You have these people describing to the British that they worship Kali, that they strangle in particular ways. The British, Meadows Taylor invented that, but in the original archival record, you can see these kind of things being described. So how do we explain that? And that's why I look to the work of micro-historians in particular. Carlo Ginzburg was extremely influential in sort of giving me some ideas about how to approach this. work of Natalie Seaman Davis as well, the whole sort of Peter Burke school of European early modern social history and cultural history. And so I looked very, very closely at these interviews between the British officer and the captured Thug, and what the dynamic between, or the dynamic in an interrogation, what that does. Because obviously we know, if there's a gallows outside, and you have a white man who's essentially judge and executioner, he tells the Indian prisoner, tell me what Thuggee is, or you hang. The Indian prisoner is going to say something. Can we rely on what's being said? No, it's very problematic. You're going to say, it's the same with torture really. We have no evidence that the British resorted to torture, but there's still the pressure, there's still the threat of execution and various other repercussions. So the whole power dynamic is so problematic, which is why we can't just talk about a confession as being this honest and truthful, almost exposure of Indian society. When I look closer at these accounts, I realized that the Thug prisoners themselves were trying to describe themselves as separate from criminals. We are not thieves. There's a famous interaction where, because the British, they conducted, dozens, if not hundreds of these interviews, and they kept them. Why? Because it's an ethnographic state. It's absolutely obsessed with understanding local society. And so sometimes the prisoners, they would talk about other criminals and saying, no, we're not just murderers. We're not thieves. You can put a bag full of money, gold, next to me, and I won't touch it. I might strangle you and take it. And what they constantly invoke is actually a gentlemanly warrior ideal. What they wanted to describe themselves as being was respectable and not just criminals. Why? Because they've been imprisoned by the British. When you're captured, there's no way out. The rest of their future, their lives depend on how they can first convince the British that they're useful, but they also have sort of a moment of self-fashioning. Because the British are desperate for these prisoners to expose and reveal the truth without any ability to check it. And so you have a dynamic in which the British are looking for evidence of superstition, of ritual, and then the Indian prisoners, in a sense, confirming those expectations, and in that process showing them, a mere criminal would just steal or kill anybody, but no, we follow rules. My forefather did the same as me. It's not because I'm hungry or don't have a job that I'm killing people, it's because it is almost sort of a professional endeavor. And there's a sense of pride and martial prowess. So we can see how the strategy of, respectively, the prisoners and the British interrogator converged around the construction of Thuggee as something unique, something that is bound by ritual, something that does run in the family. We can't just reduce it to say, oh, this is an Orientalist construction. This is something the British made up out of the blue. We also can't say, oh, this is actually a complete truthful exposure of what was happening. But we have something that is uniquely the product of the colonial encounter. You can't disentangle which are the Indian parts of it and which are the British parts of it, because they're product of a sort of an uneven conversation or dialogue, but a conversation nonetheless. And so what were the Thugs? What can we say about them? You have criminal underworlds anywhere in the world. Think about the mafia. Think about the Chinese tongs. It exists anywhere in the world. There's nothing unique about criminals speaking a sort of secret language, lingo, using secret signs. There's nothing unique about wandering people, taking up odd jobs, and in a sense being rather opportunistic in the way they make a living for themselves. Why would you choose to strangle people? Why not, use a sword or a knife? Well, two reasons. If you have to carry out violent open banditry, you need to be mounted. You need to have weapons to attack, whomever you want to plunder. Strangling people. Anybody has a scarf. Anybody has a pagri or turban. So in a sense, Thuggee is the continuation of a military lifestyle by means deprived by men deprived of the means to carry out open banditry. And so it is really, sort of a last resort being a thug. But of course, at the same time, if you strangle somebody and you leave the body, it's not messy, there's no blood. And yes, the thugs, they would bury their victims. And to the British, it was like, people would disappear from the surface of the earth. That's not actually true. Sometimes they just kick them in a ditch. But again, you have this play between, objectively speaking, a social reality of violent banditry taking place, but the British reading it through these sort of colonial Orientalist eyes and turning it into something that was far more devious, but again, legitimized, justified colonial presence. What I have tried to do in the book that I wrote is to, in a sense, show how these different perspectives all contribute to the story. How the British experienced Thuggee as a sort of almost moral panic of murders that could happen just under their nose. The existence of Thuggee is, of course, an extreme affront to a colonial state that prides itself of having replaced despotic Orientalism and introduced rule of law, right? You can't have these secret assassins and murderers almost mocking British control by being able to carry out these crimes. And then you have the local villages where the story is completely different, where the story is about the men leaving every year on an expedition. Maybe they're going to serve as mercenaries or fight with the Pindaris. Maybe they're going to strangle people, but they bring back loot, they bring back money, and that is how the local community actually survives. And I found in this particular village that I was working on that there were tax lists dating back to the pre-British period where the thugs, they would pay a certain amount of their loot to the local landlords. It was fully institutionalized, and there was nothing corrupt or wrong about it, precisely because the thugs could invoke the warrior gentleman ideal of not just murdering anybody, but being highly selective, being very careful in how they carried out these things. And of course, again, for the British to come across a tax list of ritual stranglers paying the local state, again, fits into this notion that India before the British arrived was corrupt, decadent, despotic, and that the British themselves become the harbingers of law and order. Not just protecting colonial interests or the prestige of the East India Company, but protecting India lives as well. That's of course the clinching argument for colonialism. This is not just out of economic interest or political interest, but that the British ultimately are serving this ideal of the white man's burden. It's of course a stereotype, it's a trope, we know that. But that is why Thuggee became this big thing that has been sort of pulled out time and again as not just being fascinating, but also being the proof that East India Company was not an exploitative operation, but actually had these social function in British India. I don't know, I could say more, but we could also perhaps...
I've got a few questions.
Please.
Start us off, and
Yep.
then I have a few questions. Thank you so much, Kim, for that really clear and provocative, I suppose, not just an overview of a book, but also really sort of gave us some of the flavor of the book and the kinds of materials you were working with. First question's a practical question, and it's one that, as you say, many historians of different times and places have grappled with, and you grappled with it acutely writing this book, which is really, how do you peel away the layers of what goes into that colonial archive in terms of what survives in the legal record? Tell us a little bit about, what was it like for you reading these trial transcripts? What were you looking for? How, in a sense, were you trying to read them against the grain? What were you able to do to try to sort of hear other voices? And what was your process there?
So, of course, when you work with any kind of historical archive, you are limited by the nature of the material. And there are some questions you can't answer. We could have been in a situation where it would have been impossible to actually say much more about the subject. But luckily, as I mentioned, because of this colonial and particularly British obsession with bureaucracy, everything is recorded. So you have pages and pages of these interviews where the British officer is asking sometimes deeply bizarre questions for us. But since you have the questions and the answers, and there's parentheses where it says somebody is laughing in the background, or the prisoner, he got misty-eyed, and then sometimes there's more than one informant, and they start fighting amongst each other, and it's recorded. It actually allows you to sort of peel back and take a closer look. So for instance, one of the British officers who had Indian artists produce some of these very colorful illustrations, which you might have seen. If you Google Thuggee and you look at images, you get these watercolors that the British had Indian artists produce. But he asks one of the thugs, so how does it feel to strangle? How does it feel to strangle a person? And the thug is sitting there, and you can almost see, it's almost sort of a hitman or an assassin being asked by the police how cool he is, or how quick he is. And so the thug, he said, I can strangle a man faster than you can write it down. Which is, of course, shows just how aware the prisoner is of him being interrogated. And you can also quite clearly see he is bragging, and the other prisoners are sitting around him. So there's also a different dynamic in that sense. You can see what kind of questions elicits different types of answers. More interestingly, sometimes the British officer says, who do you kill, who do you not kill? And somebody would say, we kill anybody when we are hungry enough. And then another thug would say, no, we would never kill low-caste people or women or something like that. And you can see this is not a cult, this is not a caste or a sect. The criminals involved in rather more pragmatic practices, but who are then forced to, in a sense, give voice to things they probably never thought that much about.
No, that's great. I mean, I think scholars writing, I suppose, one scholarly generation before you, I think had probably gone all the way down the route of saying, well, this was all just in the British imagination. Did you see yourself as, in a sense, trying to get out of that dead end within the field in terms of what do we do with the fact that, of course, there's this deeply unequal power relationship that has produced a very asymmetrical kind of archive? And did you think that, in a sense, taking it a step further than saying, well, of course, this archive is absolutely suffused with British presumptions about India and ideas about India, and yet we have to go beyond that? I mean, is that what you saw yourself as doing?
Yes, I was driven by this sort of angry young man, which is also sort of part of being a historian and writing a PhD. You have to sort of kill the generation before you and make a place for yourself. But I really did feel that the post-colonial intervention in this particular case was supremely unhelpful. I mean, this was still at a time when Edward Said was invoked, and it's quite clear, as you say, the colonial archive, the British descriptions of the thugs were just replete with stereotypes and tropes. But we can also turn it on its head. There were dead bodies being found. They didn't drop from the sky. Something did happen. And now, can we actually use this deeply problematic archive to go a bit deeper? But it is, of course, a precarious balance that you walk between using an archive like this. Imagine having to reconstruct the history of the Holocaust, and all you had was accounts by the Nazis. That is the problem we're talking about, that you don't actually have both sides, except in these rare cases where they sort of, they're sort of brief glimpses of different voices and of different experiences. And that's what, reading the colonial archive against the grain, that's the sort of craft involved in that.
No, that's really great, and I think you brought out in your talk the way in which, in fact, there are resonances with many other fields, the study of witchcraft in early modern Europe, the study of slavery in North America as well, and the use of trial transcripts and these moments where people who have left very little written record of their own views at least survive in the archive, albeit in a very structured form, in the form of a trial, in the form of a trial under duress. And I think, that's one of the things that I think has been so illuminating about the book, and that stood the test of time. And one thing that struck me when I first read it, which came out again in your talk just now, Kim, is the importance of you having seen that landscape for yourself. And it strikes me that, to the extent that when you were doing your research, and perhaps still today, those were still seen as regions of India associated with particular forms of banditry or dacoity. Is there a sort of longer story to be told there, in a sense, about how incompletely the British were ever able to govern that part of India? Or do you think, in a sense, that they triumphed? What's the outcome of this, if I could sort of take you forward a little bit?
That's a very good question. I think the most obvious legacy of the whole Thuggee scare, if you want, is very clearly the invention of the criminal tribes and the passing of the Criminal Tribes Act from 1870s and onwards. And that is one that has profound implications, and you can see the legacies today. That comes out of the same thinking, namely that there was in India such a thing as hereditary criminals. People were born criminal, and they couldn't be reformed. It was not just their caste or their beliefs, it was who they were. It's before the sort of time of sort of criminal theories that's about, embodied criminality and that kind of, but the British would have said it's in their DNA if they had had that language at the time. Yes. And I think that's where you see the real, and in many ways deeply tragic results of this.
I mean, in some ways, as well as moving beyond the idea that this is purely a figment of the British imagination or a British panic, I suppose you're also refining another way we could read this, which is, I suppose, in a more romantic vein as all resistance. I mean, you mention in your book, of course, Eric Hobsbawm's classic work on banditry, and really see bandits as social rebels, as rebels against the established order. I mean, how far would you go in seeing the thugs as, in a sense, rebelling against the political order that they inhabited? Or how far do you think that perspective is itself misleading and unhelpful?
Yeah, I would go for the latter. Dacoits are often today presented as sort of Robin Hood types, which are essentially noble rebels, so the buggy stereotype or myth. And there have been attempts to make the Thugs fit into this as sort of pre-political rebels, using the weapons of the weak to protest, except the Thugs, they killed anybody that they thought they could get loot from. They're not actually involved in any kind of rebellious behavior. So there's very much sort of a historiographical moment in the 60s and 70s when there was this attempt at reading nobility and in a sense romance into any kinds of violence by the poor.
Great. I'll ask one more question, and then we should have plenty of time to open it up to the to all of you. There's going to be a new Oxford Classics edition of the novel Confessions of a Thug, and you're going to write the introduction. This text still has a life, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you think this story plays in relation to contemporary debates that are going on both in India and in Britain about the legacies of empire. I mean, that's a big question, but I think there was something that throughout your talk you pointed to this thread of imperial self-justification, that, the thugs explain why in the end this was a redeeming force. And those arguments haven't gone away, and I wonder how you think this new edition is going to be received, for example, by different audiences.
That's a very good question, one that I hadn't thought about at all. I know I think the reason they're bringing out a new edition is because of this failed Bollywood movie, Thugs of Hindustan, which they thought would create sort of a huge market for anything, really. I think the novel still occupies a strange space between literary studies as sort of a quintessentially Anglo-Indian novel that you would read alongside Kipling, for instance, and then an essentially true story about the exotic Orient. Mm-hmm. It is a picaresque novel. It's very long, it's not that exciting, but basically this Amir Ali character, he travels throughout India, he visits Taj Mahal, different ruins, almost like a British tourist would, which is exactly how it was sort of conceived in literary terms. But I actually do need to think about how we read it today, and especially after Brexit and the collapse of the civilized world.
On that note, the floor is open to questions.
Hello. Thank you so much. This has been very intriguing. I'm very curious for you to please comment on the ground research in the village. Because obviously you are a Brit.
I'm Danish.
Danish. Oh, sorry. Okay, so you're Western.
I've been called worse.
You're Western. You're Western, and you're going into a village, and you're doing on-the-ground research. What's to say that they weren't doing the same thing to you as they were doing to the British interrogators?
That's a very good question. They had very different stories to tell. So there was a British officer who, according to colonial legend, was strangled by Thugs in this village. But the villager's story was that he shot a peacock, which is a sacred animal, and therefore the villagers, they killed him, and that was a justification for it. They also told stories about how the Thugs, they resisted the British, very clearly using sort of the language of the 20th century about the freedom movement. So I could see in the oral tales that were still existed, there were sort of several historical layers that were interwoven. And I was very conscious about that. Because, yeah, of course, whenever you talk to somebody who wants information from you, there are different truths. So, I mean, that is part of doing this kind of research.
Yeah, sorry. What was the ethnic mix of the Thugs? As you mentioned the Pindaris, what I've read about the Pindaris is they were mostly Pathan mercenaries who were bribed by the British to, as in, decrease the power of the Marathas. And you mentioned that that place is, as in, not a very arable land. What do you think about the cinematic depictions of the Thugs? For example, there was a Pierce Brosnan movie with Shashi Kapoor and the one you mentioned lately, Thugs of...
Thank you. So the Thugs, they reflected the local population. There's no particular, I mean, anybody could be a Thug because it was not a primary identity. If you were a soldier in an army and the army got disbanded, you could do any number of things, but become bandit was one of them. So we see Hindus and Muslims work together. In terms of the movies, you're talking about the Merchant Ivory productions, Deceivers from 1988, which I inflict on my students once in a while. It's hopelessly silly to see Pierce Brosnan, you know, putting on walnut oil and going native. But that's, of course, in keeping with this colonial fantasy of unmitigated access to indigenous society. And that's what the Confessions of a Thug is also doing in literary form, imagining that the British can, in a sense, be the fly on the wall and see everything that goes on. They never could, which is why the stories where they can are so popular. It's sort of a self-soothing, self-reassuring narrative about nothing escapes our knowledge. We can simply dress up as an Indian and spy. The key, there's of course an issue of race here, the sense that Pierce Brosnan blacks up. So within a colonial worldview, a white man can go native. A native can never become white because civilizational hierarchy determines these kind of things. And you see that even in you know, fairly recent depictions.
Yeah, thank you for that very interesting talk. And it seems that this discussion is, for me, it's really kind of complicated understandings of the ethnographic state and colonial knowledge and Orientalism more generally. But my question relates to a little bit what Sunil was saying towards the end about governability. And to what extent does your discussion on the Thuggees, does that talk about the extents and limitations of British rule during this period? And secondly, another short question. Talking about the archives, through your investigation of these sources, did you engage with local dialects or of particular Indian languages spoken by these communities? Thank you.
I think it's very obvious by the time that Thuggee is discovered, in inverted commas, by William Henry Sleeman, who's the officer who really builds his name through this. He's basically, the Thugs have been arrested and interviewed and interrogated for several decades before that. There's very clearly a sense of particular officers sexing up the material in order to get more resources, but also, of course, in order to establish themselves as having this unmediated access to indigenous society. Sleeman does create a sense of a moral panic and an urgent threat that undermines the narrative of the British being in control, and that's very much what Meadows Taylor does in the novel. The novel ends with sort of a note of caution for the British not to be too complacent, because if they relinquish their grip of India, these horrible practices will reoccur. Thuggee was nothing compared to the Pindari or Maratha wars. It didn't have an impact on trade or anything like that. It's a bit like sati. I mean, the numbers of sati that actually took place during the 1820s that the British recorded, we're talking about 500 over a 10-year period in Bengal. It's not as if it's everywhere going on all the time, but the British, of course, utilize these particular cases and highlights them because they ultimately justify British rule. In terms of local languages, I did a lot of work on the secret language of the Thugs, which the British, they made sort of vocabularies of. And I had help from other people and linguists. But there were terms that you could see are still used today by Kanjas or by the people who were Banjaras. So the language is one of the pieces of evidence that allow you to say something about an indigenous underworld. Because there are networks of cheats, conmen, thieves, murderers, anywhere in the world who have secret signs. And that's what the British recorded as a Thug language. But really it was a colonial mindset encountering what is really quite common practices in many ways.
So you raised a very interesting comment. You use the word assassins and Thuggees sequentially very often. Could you contrast the Thuggees of India with the assassins of the Middle East, apart from their weapons that they used?
There is a tradition within terrorism studies in which you draw links between the Hashashin, the Thugs, and modern-day Islamic suicide terrorists, and that is complete and utter nonsense. There's no basis for that. But again, I mean, so much that's being talked about suicide terrorism or the use of fanatics today has deep colonial roots in the sense of resurrecting colonial knowledge in many ways. Again, that's to suggest that the Thugs were related somehow to the Hashashin is to indicate that this is a timeless practice that has nothing to do with political turmoil or the expansion of the British, and that it is an essential almost feature of non-Western society that you have these evil organizations. I would be very, very suspicious of most of the literature on the Hashashin and the Thugs that tries to establish this sort of ahistorical or supra-historical genealogy.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. See, the gentleman asked about the ethnic or, okay. One of the gentlemen asked about the ethnic and different backgrounds, religious backgrounds, yet the British overwhelmingly describe Thuggees as Kali worshippers. So there is a narrative maybe the British want to present, but is it also ignorance? Because I remember reading a little bit portions of online, there was a book by British, I forget his name, the caste, the criminal caste and tribes of Rajasthan. So as somebody who's from Rajasthan, a little bit familiar with some of the tribes that he was talking about, I felt it was also genuine ignorance because he didn't really understand what he was writing. So, for example, when they say Kali worshipper, but then you say they are from different backgrounds, is it genuine ignorance and not just a propaganda? That the British are, I mean, how much do they understand what they're writing about? Like an example, like for example, one of the tribes in that book, the British were describing the women wearing skimpy clothing. But in Rajasthan, nobody thinks their clothing is skimpy. They're just tribal women who wear the kind of clothing that they wear. And nobody would raise their eyebrows at it. So is it ignorance?
It's a combination. So one of the things is, the Thugs were not Kali worshippers. But they never mentioned Kali. They mentioned Devi or Bhavani in very particular context. And that's where, again, you can see there is an invocation of a particular sort of martial ethos. Of course, there are particular Bhavani temples in particular that cater to, even today, to corrupt politicians and gundas and these kind of places. So we're talking about a type of sort of religious patronage, much like different guilds in medieval Europe would have particular saints. But of course, from a European perspective, that becomes Kali worship. Yes, the British understanding of Indian identities is deeply problematic. But it's also because it's very different from what we see today. So both Hindu and Muslim Thugs would worship Bhavani or Devi at particular festivals. It was the kind of syncretism that you experience in rural India during the early 19th century is mind-boggling if you presume that you have two entirely distinct communal categories. But if you go to the countryside, non-Muslims will go to the shrine of a peer, and you have far more fluid sort of practices, everyday practices, which of course to the British, who had a very clear-cut perception of Indian society, made it really super weird and mysterious that, you have these Muslim Thugs worshipping Kali, it makes no sense. But actually it's not nearly as remarkable as they assumed.
Good evening, sir. Go ahead. Sir, you often mention the villages and the villagers. So, as a literature student, I want to ask that what are the folklores and the mythologies, or the myths you discovered during your exploration in that village? Those about the thugs and the thuggee and the bandits. And as you said, they thought themselves as heroes and the figures of heroism, because what they were doing, they thought that they were heroes. So what was the perception of the villagers and what you discovered there?
So I wrote the book and I returned to the village and I showed them, and they got deeply upset because it was called Thugs and it had a picture of that region on it. And that's because what they always said, that there used to be Thugs around and they were in the next village. So in every village, the Thugs were in the next village. It's a bit like dacoits. Sometimes you can be proud of a particular dacoit, but these are slippery characters, right? It's not actually, you don't want to be known as the Thug village or the dacoit village, actually. But there was a lot of, as I mentioned, there was many layers of different stages of colonial expansion sort of collapsed into the same narratives, which is what you find when you have oral tradition and these kind of things. But for the villages, it was all about how the region came under British rule and the kind of resistance that took place in the early 19th century. But then there were later, 20th century Chambal Valley dacoity stuff, which is entirely different. And then there was a freedom struggle as well that was sort of put all together. But it was incredibly interesting for me to see even glimpses of the story that I had read about in the archives actually still being alive. I mean, that's the kind of thing historians, they dream of. It's easy to read an old handwriting from 1812, but then to actually have people today living who can tell the same story but from a completely different perspective is sort of the moments we live for in terms of research.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. So my question is a bit more about your field of research. In terms of, there's You said something about something being quite unremarkable once we re-examine it in history. And I was really interested in this question of, how things that are remarkable and unremarkable in history, and then their relationship with propaganda, because they're used to feed propaganda. But as a historian, as a researcher, what is your relationship with these seemingly unremarkable things in history that you discover? Because they don't naturally feed into propaganda yet. Any comments on that?
Well, those are the kind of glimpses where you can see the British describing things that don't actually match their own preconceptions, and where you have to, where you kind of see there's a slippage in the propaganda and some kind of truth slips through almost inadvertently. And maybe it's very minor things, but it allows you to, tease apart a few more things. So for instance, one of the stories that the British were told by these prisoners was that if you strangle a person on the left side of the road and there's an owl hooting or whatever, the ghosts won't haunt you. And you can see how somebody who kills people would actually establish some kind of narrative that allowed them to do so without any sort of moral compunction. And again, it fed into a British narrative, but also it makes sense from a different perspective.
We wish to thank Kim Wagner and Sunil Amrith, and we'd also like to thank our sponsor for the session, dainikbhaskar.com. Can we please give them a big round of applause? Coming up next, right here at the bar hall, we've got a book launch, which was supposed to be at Samvad. Think of It by Unruly in just a few moments.